In the wake of multiple killings by ICE agents in Minnesota, New York State Senator Jake Ashby, a Capital Region Republican, introduced legislation that he hopes will refocus the deployment of federal immigration officials on criminal threats, at least here in the Empire State. To discuss his proposal and the broader landscape, we're joined in the Capitol Press Room studio by Senator Ashby. Thanks for making the time, Senator.
Dave, thanks for having me.
Well, before we get into the technical aspects of your bill, I want to start with your philosophy around this issue, which, based on your bill memo, is that police officers should focus on criminal law enforcement. There are people, though, in both parties, particularly Republicans, though, who don't see a big difference, though, between criminal law enforcement and civil immigration enforcement. So can you talk about your worldview on this issue and how you reached it?
Sure. So I think most people would agree that what we've seen happen in Minnesota and in other cities across the U.S. and here, too, frankly, isn't what we want out of our immigration policy or enforcement. And so that was the impetus for, drafting this bill. And really, we hoped that, and I know that it is having this effect, that it would prompt discussion, right? That it would prompt a discussion drawing attention to the lack of effective federal policy and really what we can do at the state level to push for that. My belief, I think, is evident in the bill, and that if you believe that someone has broken the law and want to pursue them for immigration purposes, get a judicial warrant. And sometimes I wonder if my colleagues and federal personnel look to the civil aspect of this or the warrantless aspect of this as an option to sidestep that. And I think if most people give this topic any time and critical thinking, they would realize that if we are going at it that way, then there is a deep flaw within our federal policy and federal law. If we, as a larger segment in the population, are pushing law enforcement to sidestep the criminal pursuit in terms of civil enforcement. And that's why I think we're running into a lot of these problems. And some people may say, oh, well, we don't have the resources for that. We don't have, the number of U.S. attorneys. We don't have the proper resources in the courts. Okay? Well, let's go get them. Let's get that federal policy in place to where we can handle that.
Well, why don't we get into the meat and potatoes then of your bill? Under what circumstances do you envision local and state law enforcement working with immigration officials like ICE agents, and what are some of the activities that you'd like to prevent? I mean, you mentioned the judicial warrants there, so can you expand on that, for example?
Sure. So I think state and local law enforcement should be able to work with federal law enforcement at the border. I think they should be able to work with them when they're pursuing criminal elements. I think they should be able to work with them when they're in the jails. I think if someone is detained and law enforcement wants to know if they're wanted for murder, I think the general public should be, most likely, is in support of that. They want to know who they're holding there. So that's what this bill would allow for. What I don't think is right is when we are pursuing warrantless action in preschools, hospitals, schools in general. I don't think that's what most people look to in terms of immigration enforcement. And I think that's becoming, more and more inflammatory.
Yeah, you mentioned schools, for example. You have restrictions on so-called sensitive areas and list out schools, child care facilities, hospitals, and places of worship. To sensitive locations would extend to 300 feet beyond those property lines. Why do you draw a distinction there? Why should any of this stop at the borders of a school versus any other sort of private but publicly accessible institution?
Well, I think there should be limitations based on what we've seen. And keep in mind that there is a sunset on this bill. It's 1 year. And again, we did that really to prompt the discussion on this. But there have been precedent. There has been precedent for sensitive locations and other types of bills. So we looked at that. We looked at the distance. We talked about what would be appropriate, what wouldn't be appropriate. But really, our aim here is to focus on what has happened, why it's gone wrong, right, and what we can do at the state level to prompt the discussion to fix it.
Well, you said that a couple times, the idea of prompting a discussion. And we've got the governor who's highlighted some changes in both her State of the State and her budget address. We've got Democratic progressive lawmakers who are pushing what's known as the New York for All Act, which, as I read it, seems to be more of an extensive and expansive version of your bill. So do you feel like the discussions just are missing the mark? Is that the problem to date? Or do you feel like there just isn't enough discussion?
I think that they're missing the mark. We had started drafting this bill well before the governor had released hers, and it just kind of timed that way. And there was a period of time, I still haven't seen bill text on what she's putting out. I've heard discussions.
I've got the program bills. I can send them to you after this.
Yeah. So there was a little bit of a delay in that. But again, I think there's an imbalance in those discussions, right? We put our bill out there. I would hope that they've taken a look at it. I'm pretty sure that they have in the discussions that I've had with my colleagues. But how many other Republicans are putting out bills like this? And are they reaching the levels of leadership to where they're going to be pushing on our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to adopt some of those provisions? I think if you look at our bill, I would say, and I'm biased on this, it's better than what the governor's put out because it allows for cooperation with law enforcement and in certain aspects, and hers, to my knowledge, excludes it in some of the ways that we have. And I think we have to keep that balance in public safety. We can't let emotions get the best of what we want policy-wise.
Well, you bring up the partisanship with some issue like this, and if I was to read your bill text blindly, if I didn't know it was from Capital Region Republican Jake Ashby, I would assume this was a moderate Democrat's proposal. And given that immigration is a politically sensitive issue on both sides of the aisle, and because we have a Democratic majority here in Albany, I don't want to break this to you, your bill's not going to move. So what made you stick your head?
Wait a minute, Dave. You got to be kidding me.
I know. Breaking news here. So what made you want to stick your head then out of the foxhole and offer up an idea in writing when there's no political upside to it? I mean, this, to be Pollyannish for a second, it does seem like that kind of, hey, this guy's actually trying to start a debate, and maybe I'm not being cynical enough here. I mean, you're cognizant of all of that, right?
I do believe there's a political upside to it. Because I do believe that there are people out there.
You might have different primary voters than some other Republicans.
On both sides of the aisle that see the value in this. I do believe that there's an upside. And we've done this before. We've drafted immigration-related legislation, and it passed. We got support. Granted, it's not as broad as this, but we were able to get bipartisan support. It took a number of years to go through. And I'm not suggesting that this legislation in its entirety is going to be adopted and passed, but I would like to think that there may be parts of it that will be taken, that will be looked at and seen as added value to a larger policy. And that's the way to influence the discussion and influence policy. And I think some of my colleagues get that. I don't know if all of them get that.
Well, sticking with the realities of Albany, it is likely that the option that you'll get presented with is either some version of the New York for All Act, which has a lot of the same spirit of your bill, but maybe is a lot more extensive and prescriptive when it comes to what's being described, or no. You can either say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to vote against that. Do you have a sense of what you would prefer if that question comes before you?
If I had to choose between the New York For All Act or
Nothing.
my bill?
No, or nothing.
Or nothing?
In that crazy world where your bill doesn't come up for a floor vote.
I would have a hard time supporting the New York For All Act because it excludes cooperation with law enforcement where I feel like there's necessary value for public safety. I would have to take a look at it in the form that it would be voted on because sometimes bills change.
Sure. And I think this one would definitely change before it ever got to a floor vote.
Yeah. But as it stands right now and as I understand it, I would probably vote against it.
And coming back to your bill, in terms of a discussion, we're talking about it, but have you heard from any of your colleagues or any of your colleagues across the aisle yet? Or are you reaching out to say, hey, I've got this thing as well?
Yes. Yeah, I've heard from a number of my colleagues, had discussions at multiple levels of government, and there's a lot of support for it. There's some reluctance and reticence on their ability to be supportive in a more vocal way. I think that there's political constraints, but to your earlier point, it still adds value because it gets people moving in that direction. And ultimately I think that's a huge part of this job that I sometimes think people miss, is not necessarily to get out there and fan the flames, right, and try and make things more inflammatory, but just moving towards more sounder policy, moving to a point where we can work together rather than beat each other up.
Well, we've been speaking with State Senator Jake Ashby. He is a Capital Region Republican. Senator, thanks for visiting us in the studio.
Dave, thanks for having me, as always.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.